Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome you all again to the online course on East Caucasian languages organized by the Linguistic Convergence Laboratory on the HSE University in Moscow, Russia. My name is George Moros. I'm a junior research fellow in the lab and the moderator of today's session. Today is the third lecture in the series of 9 entitled Nominal Stems in East Caucasian. It will be given by Stephen Kaye. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to clarify some organization issues. Each lecture will be recorded, live streamed on YouTube, and stored there afterwards. The lectures will go uninterrupted, followed by a question period. Those of you who are joining the lectures via Zoom will be muted throughout the session in the interest of the lecture and sound quality. You may send your questions via the Zoom chat or YouTube live chat. At the end of the talk, I will read selected questions out loud for the speaker to answer them. We apologize in advance that there might be not be enough time to address all the questions, but Stephen will be able to read them afterwards, after the talk, and hopefully find a way to answer you. In order to make it easier for our speaker to answer and reach out in the future, we kindly ask you to use your real name and last name in the Zoom chat. It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Kaye, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Surrey Morphology Group. Stephen completed his doctorate at the University of Oxford and wrote his PhD thesis on conjugation class from Latin to Romance, heteroclisis, and diachrony and synchrony. Stephen participated in several projects connected to minority languages. He worked on Northern Talisi and Iranian minority language spoken in Azerbaijan, and he is currently working on several East Caucasian languages, including Zilo and Di. Since we share the same field, and people sometimes confuse me for Stephen and the other way around, I can tell that our consultants were very impressed with Stephen's proficiency in the language, even after working on it for only a very short time. Currently, Stephen works on the project External Agreement with Marietje Makina and Oliver Bond at the University of Surrey. In 2019, Stephen co-organized a workshop on this phenomenon at the SLE conference in Leipzig. The project group is currently working on a database dedicated to such unusual phenomena. Today's lecture will be on nominal stems in East Caucasian. Stephen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to give a talk as part of this series. So I will share my slides with you now. I've also put them into the chat in case that is useful. So let me just bring that up in a kind of full view. Hopefully you can all see that okay. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about nominal inflection, and in particular, how stem formation works inside the nominal inflectional paradigm, which might sound kind of niche and very specific, but I hope you'll come away with the impression that this is a topic that does deserve its own session in a series on East Caucasian, for reasons that I'm going to try and lay out for you over the course of the next hour or so. Obviously, it's not exactly unusual for a language to have nominal inflection and to have paradigms and stem formation and such. But when you look across languages, you find that there is something pretty distinctive about how East Caucasian noun paradigms look, how they work structurally. There's a certain feel to them. And within the family, there's a high degree of consensus across different languages about exactly how the morphology of the noun paradigm works. The languages of the family are more similar in this respect than they are in lots of other parts of the grammar. One aspect of this similarity is quite famous or even notorious from the point of view of linguistic typology. And Misha Daniel talked about it in a lecture in this series last year, that's the fact that the languages of Dagestan, at least, very often have large systems of spatial cases. So to do with motion and position, which can involve multiple dimensions at the same time, such as whether you're talking about on something or in something or under it, and whether you're moving to or from, and whether you're referring to a precise location or an approximate location. And this can make very big nominal paradigms, which is one thing that East Caucasian has become famous for in the world of linguistics at large. Now, I'm not going to be talking about that topic here today. I'm going to be talking about what is kind of the other big thing typologically about East Caucasian nominal paradigms, which is that to a large extent, they have a characteristic way of using their inflectional material inside the paradigm to give the paradigm a distinctive shape. East Caucasian is an old family with lots of languages in it, divided into several branches. They're diverse in various ways, but this is one area of the grammar where there's a real family resemblance, I think, kind of East Caucasian signature. So the plan for today is as follows. I'm going to start with a quick recap of what an East Caucasian noun paradigm is like in general, what kind of things the inflectional system encodes. That's just to set up the ground rules before we get into looking at how the morphological material works in particular. Then I'm going to move on to the point which I'm focusing on here, which is how nominal stems operate inside the paradigm and what it is about this that makes it worth noticing and kind of distinctively East Caucasian. So I'll take some examples of paradigms from particular languages and draw out what it is about them that make them typical of the family. But then against that background, obviously languages don't all work the same in detail. So I'll show some of the big ways that different languages turn out to vary within the confines of this general setup. So quite a lot of this talk is going to be about what kind of variation you can get across these languages. And it might sound like this is all just about identifying various patterns inside the noun lexicon. I'll show that it's actually a bit more complicated and a bit more interesting than that, because the system that I'm talking about here doesn't actually just apply to nouns. So I'll look at a characteristic that you see quite widely in languages of the family, where once you've spotted these stem formation processes going on, you can see that they seem to get involved in things that are a bit more syntactic. And that can make it quite difficult to decide exactly how you want to describe the system synchronically. So that's extending the system beyond nouns, that last section there. Okay, so to get the ball rolling with a general introduction, what is there to say about nominals in East Caucasian in the broadest outlines, the really basic stuff? There are two important features that are relevant to nominal inflection, which you could think of as the two dimensions that you need to build a paradigm. On the one hand, there is number, so singular versus plural. Some descriptions distinguish between a plural of the normal kind and a collective plural, meaning for things like Ali and his family, or that kind of thing. I'm just going to be talking about an opposition of singular versus plural. And on the other hand, there's case. And as I said, of course, in many East Caucasian languages, it's useful to divide the cases up into more core cases that predominantly do grammatical or structural things like marking subjects and objects, and spatial cases. But that distinction isn't going to be so relevant to me here. So I'm just going to be treating case as a single dimension of the paradigm. And I'm not going to have the space on the screen to show all the cases all the time, far from it. In most languages of the family, but not absolutely all of them, there's another important feature to know about when it comes to nominals, which is what gender they belong to, or what is often called noun class in the context of East Caucasian. So there are a few languages which don't have grammatical gender anymore as a category. That's Udi, Agril, Lesgian, and Southern Tabasaran varieties, which all belong to the Lesgic branch of the family. But in most languages, there are various genders which all belong, which go from just 2 genders elsewhere in Tabasaran up to 8 in Batsby, depending on how you count these things exactly. And in general, kind of by definition, you can tell what gender a noun belongs to because of how other words in the sentence agree with it. Now, it might seem that gender is not going to be that important here in a discussion of the nominal paradigm, because a noun usually just is lexically assigned to a particular gender. it doesn't actually need to inflect for gender. Gender is kind of a stable feature across the whole of the paradigm. So unlike number and case, you wouldn't expect to need gender as a dimension of the paradigm. But actually, gender is going to turn out to be relevant here later on. So that will come up later. And as I said, although this is largely about nouns, it isn't just going to be about nouns, because nouns aren't the only things that can appear in the kind of syntactic positions where you might need to inflect for case and number. Pronouns obviously do that too, but they're kind of their own thing, personal pronouns especially, and they're not really going to come up here. But what will come up is the fact that, well, you can take something which is basically an attributive modifier, such as an adjective or a participle, and then you can take that and use it as the head of a noun phrase. So if you have something like the attributive that means white in Sakura, the language actually lets you use that as the head of a noun phrase to mean the white one. And then, of course, if you want to put that into the plural, there has to be some inflectional way of allowing you to do that. So you can say the white ones, as in this sentence here. And besides that, there may be other things that might not exactly start out as nouns, but they can effectively be used in a kind of syntactic context where you could have had a noun. So in example 2 here from says, the idea is that you could just have had a sentence such as alcohol continues to be harmful. And alcohol would just be an ordinary noun. It would have to appear in a particular case. But what we actually have here is the clause to drink alcohol, headed by a verb in the infinitive form. And that's doing a similar kind of syntactic job in this sentence. So the point here is that you can get things which aren't simple nouns, but they might still end up being relevant to us here, and we'll see that later. But for the moment, I'm going to be talking about nouns and the inflectional paradigms of nouns. So what you're going to be seeing is a lot of this kind of thing. These are some inflected forms of the noun lexemes, which means a fly, the insect, in lac, which is generally taken to be a family level isolate in East Caucasian, so a branch of its own. This gives an example of what a paradigm looks like in the family. But as you can see, I haven't tried to include all the cases. That would be kind of pointless for what we're going to be looking at here. So I've given just a selection of cases in the singular and the plural. But of course, next to the subessive, for example, there would be a sublative and everything else. Now, straight away, you can get an impression of what's going on here. You can see that the form lexemes itself is nice and stable right across the paradigm. And then after it, you get these things happening suffixally. So basically, the topic of this talk is, what is that kind of stuff that is happening in the suffixes? Now, whatever background you come from in linguistics, you'll know that there's a general idea that you can divide languages into different morphological types. So, for example, among languages with quite complex morphology, some languages are more agglutinative, which means that you can more or less divide up the inflected word neatly into its individual morphemes and say relatively easily what each one of those bits is doing. Whereas other languages are more fusional, which basically means that it's all a lot more messy. So the classic example that's given for the agglutinative type has always been Turkish. And I'm going to stick with that trend. So I've given some inflectional forms of the word aslan, which means lion. And the point here is that in the singular, if you want to make the genitive, you just add un. If you want to make the plural, then you just add lar. And if you want to make the genitive plural, you just get to say lar un. So it's obvious which bit of the word is doing what. And basically the same inflectional morphology applies to any noun. All you have to worry about is the phonological side, which is a different thing. Morphology isn't interested. Whereas the classic example of a messy fusional language is something like Latin. But there the word for lion is leo in the nominative singular. To make the genitive, you seem to be adding nis. In the plural, you seem to be adding nes. And in the genitive plural, you use some other thing which is unrelated to either of those two things. Num. It doesn't look like nis or nes. And then if you look across the lexicon a bit, you can actually see that this n isn't really part of those suffixes at all. It's just something that has happened to the lexical part of the word. Because other nouns don't do this with an n. They just have is or ace. So this is something weird about this particular noun. And then if you sort of cast the net even more widely, you see that these endings don't even apply to all nouns in Latin. It only works for a small number of them that belong to a particular subclass of one inflectional class. And other lexemes all have their own set of forms that they would use instead in these situations. So in all these different ways, Latin has been kind of set up traditionally as sort of the opposite of Turkish in this sense. Now, to the extent that it makes sense to talk about a whole language as agglutinative like Turkish or fusional like Latin, East Caucasian is generally treated as more like the agglutinative type. So I can give you some examples from East Caucasian where everything does look nice and agglutinative. What I've got here is a portion of the nominal paradigm of the word spider from Godoberi, which belongs to the Avar-Andic branch of the family. This is Nusahar. As you can see, the citation form is the absolutive singular, with nothing extra. And then to make the ergative singular, that consists of this Nusahar plus a suffix, di. In the genitive, you add a different suffix, kli. In the dative, you add another different suffix, and in the effective case, and so on and so on. And then if you move to the plural, well, the plural marker itself is di, but that's clearly a different thing from the ergative marker, because in the ergative plural, you need both of them. So you have nusahar di. And then that plural marker di is doing exactly the same thing. It's in exactly the same place and behaving itself perfectly well, all the way down that side of the paradigm. So that's kind of all there is to it in that sense. This paradigm involves just a single stem in the singular, which is nusahar, just a single other stem in the plural, which is nusahar di, and then you add the case marking onto those stems. And this is very agglutinative. There's no kind of waste here. All of the morphological material is doing something, and it's entirely predictable how it's going to do that. So this is why I've called this an easily analyzed paradigm. Here's another paradigm from elsewhere in the family, which behaves in the same kind of way. This is a paradigm from Hinalur, which is another family level isolate. That is, it's its own branch of the family. This is the word kir, that means skin or hide. Again, you see the same kind of pattern. The plural is done by a marker dir, and that's the same throughout the paradigm. And if you look at the other dimension, you add the case suffixes to the singular and plural in exactly the same way. And each suffix is the same, whether you're adding it to the singular or the plural. Now, if East Caucasian nouns in general work like this, that would be admirably regular and easy. It would be very agglutinative, but it would give me a lot less to say in this session. You can actually argue that it would be a waste of time to present noun paradigms graphically like this at all, because if the marker of the plural is the same throughout the paradigm and the marker of each case is always the same, then all you need to know is what those morphemes are. You could just give a list. There will be no surprises about what happened when you bring them together. But anyone who has worked with these Caucasian languages a bit will know that this nice clean system isn't actually how the family generally does things. And you actually have to look quite hard to find examples like this, which are as neat as these ones that I've just presented. So to give a first impression of that, I'll go back to the lac example that I started off with, the word for fly. Now, this is all very agglutinative in the sense that you can see the zimis throughout being very well behaved. And the case endings are well behaved too. You can see that the dative is always marked with the final N, the subessive is marked with lu, and so on. And as it happens in this language, the ergative and the genitive look the same, and that always ends in an L. And the absolutive case is marked by nothing. But this time the morphology is a bit more fiddly. So there is a plural marker, which turns fly into flies, which again I've put in blue, and that's this ru. But you don't actually find it throughout the plural. In all the other cases outside the absolutive, you have this different bit of material that I've put in orange, which is irta. And that's what you need to attach the case endings to. And in the singular, you have another bit of material again, which I've put in green. You can't just add the case endings directly to the absolutive. You need to insert this element ra. So you might ask, well, why would you want to separate this ra element off, as I have done, and call it its own thing? Why don't we just say that the dative singular ending is ral? Well, first of all, that misses the sort of generalization that all of these case endings would then have ra at the beginning of them, which would be a bit of a coincidence. Also, this ra doesn't appear when you're using those cases in the plural. And on top of that, look what happens when you compare it to another noun in the language. So this is the word for law. Obviously, zakon has been borrowed in from Russian, but it's got a kind of a full paradigm inside the grammar of lag. And if you look across these two and compare them, you can see that you've got all the same case endings, but the difference is in what happens between the lexical root and the case endings. So these two lexemes require different stem formation material in order to build their case forms. So the non-absolutive forms need this stem extension ra in the singular, in the word fly, but then in the word law, they need a totally different extension, dalu. And then in the word law, if you look down the plural, there seems to be this, the new thing that you have in the absolutive kind of seems to be there all the way through. But that isn't how it worked in fly, where you have this new thing coming in. So these paradigms have a lot in common in terms of how they're structured. They distinguish the singular and the plural morphologically in a kind of left-right direction in the paradigm. But they also distinguish between absolutive and oblique, which is to say everything that isn't the absolutive in the up-down direction. And then it's the details of how they make those distinctions that are different from one word to the next. And most of this talk is going to be taken up with looking at all the interesting complications that come out of a system like this and all the different kinds of variation that you can get. But in this section, I'm just going to give a few more examples that show how you can find similar patterns of inflectional behavior in nouns right across the family. The East Caucasian is a pretty large family in terms of the number of languages. There's no consensus on exactly how many, because of course it depends on what counts as separate languages. But about 40 seems like a reasonable figure. And in terms of family relationships, they're often seen as dividing into 6 branches, which I've listed here, going more or less northwest, southeast, geographically, from Nach to Hinnaluch in the southeast. And avar andic tzezik is written in that bracketed way to mark that we take avar and andic as belonging together most closely as a genealogical unit. And then tzezik seems to be the next closest relative. Dagwa has often been talked about as if it was just a single language, but everyone recognizes now that this is a big and diverse branch, just like some of the others are. Now, as a family, Joanna Nichols has talked in this series, or rather in last year's series, about how the evidence suggests that the family is at least 6,000 years old. So it's not unlike a family as huge and diverse as Indo-European in terms of its age. So it's quite striking that as regards the nominal paradigm, the basic morphological setup we're looking at is really quite similar along all of these different, across all of these different branches. They're certainly more similar in this part of the grammar than they are in some others. So here is an example paradigm from Hasselmatt's grammar of Lesbian. This is the word dide, that means mother. So the way it is set up is a lot like what we've just been looking at. The absolutive singular is just that citation form, and all the cases are really well behaved. There's an oblique stem in the singular, which involves adding d. The absolutive plural is made with yar, but then that marker is also found in the other plural cells, but with the a missing, but with a special oblique plural marker e added on top of that. And there are a few little adjustments going on, so that vowel in yar has been effaced. The oblique plural e is apparently squished in its turn by the case suffix a, which is used in the inessive. But it's pretty clear what's going on here. And hopefully it's especially clear once I kind of hyphenate it off and put the colors in and everything. So again, what you've got, as we've seen before, is a kind of 2-stem pattern in the singular and a 2-stem pattern in the plural. So you've got a kind of absolutive versus everything else, cutting across a distinction between singular and plural. Now, something interesting to notice here is that if you look at the ergative case forms, they don't have any case marker after the oblique stem. They just are the oblique stems. Now, if you were looking at this paradigm or this language in isolation, you might say, oh, what's going on here is that the ergative marker is D, let's say. And then to make all these other cases, for some reason or other, you add that, you add the next case ending onto the ergative case ending. Now, in a sense, that's kind of true. But as we've seen what's happened in those other languages, we have a better way of talking about this now. we can say that there's an oblique stem, which is made by this element D in this particular instance. And it happens that the ergative is sort of built on that oblique stem, but you build it by not adding anything else afterwards. So all of these oblique cases are built on the same oblique stem. It just happens that the ergative doesn't have a distinctive case ending in Lesbian, whereas these other ones do. In standard Dagwa, which is based on the Akusha variety, you basically have the same thing going on. So here's a fragment of the paradigm of the word for girl, which illustrates how the whole thing works. Again, you can say that there are two stems in the singular, and there are two stems in the plural, where this extra a seems to do the job of turning the plural into the oblique plural stem. You can see that there's a little exception to this neat pattern. The genitive singular looks like it's based on the absolutive form because it doesn't have this leap on the inside of it. And that's different from what you get in the plural, where you can tell that the genitive really is based on the oblique stem. Now, it seems likely to be relevant that the oblique singular marker is li, beginning with an L, and then the case suffix also begins with an L. So at least historically, there might be some effect of haplology going on here. That's a point that we'll come back to later. And then finally, I've given a paradigm from Batsby, otherwise known as Sovatush, from the Nach branch of the family. Here again, it looks like we have a similar thing going on. The case endings are pretty stable. The singular endings need to be added to a stem built with the vowel eh. But in this case, there isn't any special oblique plural marker. The plural is marked by the vowel I throughout. And there's no special extra thing that does oblique plurals. So you can say this is basically a two-stem pattern in the singular, but it's a one-stem in the plural. And again, there's just this strange little exception that you have going on in the genitive plural. So things aren't totally neat, but clearly we're in very much the same kind of morphological world here. So to spell out some of the characteristics of East Caucasian noun paradigms, well, within a given language, case marking is largely consistent, sometimes entirely consistent across lexemes and across singular and plural. Most of the time, the absolutive singular is formally unmarked. There's often a morphological split in the paradigm between absolutive and non-absolutive forms. This can interact with the number marking system. And although we haven't seen it, we'll later see how gender can be relevant to all of this as well. One of the distinctive things about these inflectional patterns, as I said, is how often the paradigm likes to distinguish between the absolutive and everything else by using a special oblique stem. I want to spend just a second talking about that because it fits in quite well with other things about these languages. So of course, these languages have ergative alignment, and part of that is that within the clause, the argument that goes in the absolutive is almost always going to be the thing that controls agreement in the clause, for example, on the verb. So in this sentence from Hinuk, from Forker, the meaning is, I will eat you, plural, and the verb is agreeing in the human plural form because the object of the verb is the pronoun for you, plural, which is in the absolutive. So the absolutive stands out from the rest of the cases in that way. You also find that if there's some really weird morphological thing going on, it's likely to be pitting the absolutive against the rest. So for example, in Andy, you don't often get full suppletion, but there is this pronoun that does various things, including reflexive, logophoric, emphatic meanings, and it has two totally different lexical roots, J and N. And J is what you use in the absolutive, N is what you use everywhere else. And then when you go to the reciprocal, which means each other, it seems as though it's just impossible to get that word in the absolutive at all. You might think that it would be very straightforward to say something like they killed each other or they saw each other or whatever. But the language just doesn't let it happen. The syntax kind of ensures that you never need the morphological absolutive form of this word. That doesn't happen with any other case. There's another phenomenon that I could bring up here. In some languages, modifiers inside a noun phrase care about the case of their head noun. Effectively, they agree with it in case, but they're only ever sensitive to whether the head noun is in the absolutive case or in some other case. That's what you see in these examples from English, which is part of the Nach branch. The word good in attributive position has these two forms, dika, which is the basic form, the citation form, but then you use dikacha when that is modifying a head noun which is itself in a case other than the absolutive. So this absolutive versus oblique thing goes beyond just the inside workings of the nominal paradigm. So let me quickly sum up what makes this East Caucasian setup particularly interesting for morphologists in theoretical terms. What's fun about it is that clearly we're not dealing with a nominal morphology that is just totally messed up like Latin. Lots of what we're seeing here is really neat. The lexical part of the stem largely behaves very nicely, and the case marking part largely behaves very nicely too. What's curious is the stuff in between. These stem forming elements are often lexically specific. For each noun, you have to know which stem formative it will require, but they aren't exactly part of the lexeme, and they don't contribute to the lexical meaning. And you can tell that because they aren't there in the absolutive singular, where the lexical meaning is obviously the same. At the same time, they're sensitive to case that only appear if you're in the right case. If you're in the oblique case, then the oblique stem formant will appear, and if not, then it won't. But they don't actually give you any information about the case. It's the case endings that do that, and the case endings can do that perfectly well on their own. It's true that very often you can at least look at the stem formatives and say, oh, well, this one is telling me something. It's specific to the plural, so at least it's telling me about number. But even that isn't so straightforward, because even that kind of thing can be lexically specific. In some languages, you'll find that the same element can be a singular oblique stem formative in one lexeme, but a plural oblique stem formative in another lexeme. There'd be no independent way of knowing that. It's just a fact about the paradigm of those particular words. So these stem formatives live in this strange world of being kind of patterned, but also kind of arbitrary, and kind of functional, but also kind of useless. This is the sort of thing that is sometimes identified as purely morphological. It just seems to be the morphology enjoying itself, obeying its own principles, and not trying to be helpful to any other part of the system. That's in contrast to the case suffixes themselves, for example, which are part of the morphology, but at least they're actually telling you something. They're useful to the syntax in a way that this stem behavior isn't useful. Okay, so that was the basic setup. What we're going to look at from now on is basically the main different ways that languages can vary and how words within a language can vary within this general framework. So here's a selection of questions that you might ask. Does the oblique stem mean anything in its own right? It may not be obvious what that question is getting at. We'll come to some examples in a second. What is the morphological shape of the paradigm? That is, we've seen that in some nouns in some languages, the plural oblique forms are built onto the plural absolutive form. That means that you'd have to know the plural absolutive form first in some way before you can make the plural oblique. But other times that doesn't happen. So there's no implicational structure like that. So along those lines, the question is, what different types of relationship can there be between different bits of the paradigm? Another question would be, well, how easy is it to separate these things off at all? I've been hyphenating them off, but is it always possible to do that in a kind of nice, satisfactory way? And if you can do that, how many different formatives do you end up with? How many can a language have? And what kind of things can they do? And what determines the distribution of those things over the lexicon? And as I said, when you look beyond the noun, some other issues will arise. So let's dive in. Status of the oblique stem. What I mean by that is, remember that we saw there are some languages where every oblique case requires a case ending. That means that although you can identify oblique stem, you never see it bare, only with case markings added to it. It's very obviously an abstraction in that sense. That's a situation that you find in lots of languages from lots of different branches of the family. And I've just given some random examples here. So Hunsip does this, Karata, Udi, and Batsby. But at the same time, we saw that in Lesgian, the ergative doesn't have a case marker. Another way to say that is that you can find the oblique stem on its own. And if you do, you'll interpret it as an ergative. Now, what I would want to say is probably that the oblique stem is still a morphological abstraction. And it just happens that the ergative looks identical to that abstraction. But in any case, the point is that in Lesgian, it's the ergative that has that role. The same is true in standard Dagwa. And notice that in these examples, that's true in both the singular and the plural, even though they're using totally different morphological material to do it across singular and plural and from one language to another. Now, if the oblique stem is going to mean anything by itself, then it's most commonly the ergative case, but it can be a bit more complicated than that. In the grammar of Inhokwari Huashi, you can see that there are some nouns that do have a special case ending for the ergative, but only in the singular. So the ergative is only identical to the oblique stem in the plural. But then there's another major pattern that you see repeated in a few different places. This is where the genitive form is identical to the oblique stem. Or to put it another way, the rest of the paradigm beyond the absolutive is all built onto the genitive form. This is what happens in Kriz. Now, notice that I said the Lesgic languages often have the ergative in this role, but Kriz is a Lesgic language too, so there's variation about this even within the one branch. And finally, here's another example of how things can get a bit more complicated. Within Andic, you often find that there are two different ways of making a genitive, depending on the gender of the noun that you're inflecting. And what you find in Northern Akhrach is that on most nouns, there's a specific genitive ending, which is tli, as in yashotli, the girls. But to make the genitive of a masculine singular or a human plural noun, one way you can do that is just to use the oblique stem, and that's all, as here, washo, the boys. So this is one important locus of variation across languages, what they can do with their oblique stem. The next type of variation is one where there's a lot of action. There's a lot of different ways that a noun can behave. So that's this question about how the different parts of the paradigm are formally related, or if you know one bit of the paradigm, does it give you a basis for what's going to happen in another bit? Now, this way of looking at things in terms of paradigm shape is very much inspired by two long articles by Kibrik in 1991 and 2003, which go into a lot of detail about the possible paradigm shapes that you can get. And I'm only really going to scratch the surface here, but it should give some idea of how you can get languages doing subtly different things within the overall picture of things all looking quite similar. We saw that there are some instances where things are pretty simple and basically agglutinative. And this word in Hinalo was one of the places where you see that. And Hinalo in general is one of the languages where you're most likely to find that. There's no oblique marker in the singular or in the plural here. There's no absolutive oblique opposition at all. You just add the case suffixes onto the singular and the plural. You still need to know what plural suffix this particular word will want. But apart from that, it's straightforward. But that is pretty much the only language where you get the majority of words behaving like that, I think. So that's quite rare. Another rare pattern, and one that's sort of quite different, is seen here in this word from Rutul, puz, that means lip. There's something very different going on here. Here the morphology seems to notice the difference between the absolutive and the oblique stem, first of all. So look at the two ergative forms, which are standing here for the oblique part of the paradigm in general. They both contain this vowel immediately after the lexical root, which isn't there in either of the absolutive forms. So if you look at the plural oblique form, it's as if, first of all, it signals the obliqueness, and then it thinks, oh, and I should also specify that I'm plural too. And it does that by using this element m, which only marks oblique plurals, which is the kind of element that we have seen before. So ultimately, you end up with this pattern where you have two stems in the singular and two stems in the plural, which is something that we've seen plenty of already. But this particular way of going about it, where it seems like the absolutive versus oblique distinction is primary, is quite a rare pattern among noun paradigms in this family. There's another very obvious way of ending up with two stems in the singular and two in the plural, and that's just to decide that you're going to have no formal relationship whatsoever between any of those stems at all. And that's what you get in this example from Hinuk, the Tsezik language. And actually, this kind of way of doing things is a bit of a speciality of Tsezik. You don't often see it much elsewhere. So in this particular word, the oblique stem marker in the singular is li, the plural is marked by be in the absolutive, and then the oblique plural is za. So nothing like li, nothing like be, There's no kind of combination of the two. You've just got this other separate thing. But again, you end up with this very characteristic overall body plan to the paradigm, which is 2 stem in the singular and 2 stem in the plural. Now there's a variant on this behavior, which is also mostly found in Cesic, which is that you can have those 2 totally separate stems going on in the plural, but no opposition between absolutive and oblique in the singular. That's what this word from Kaye is doing. So as you can see, the alternation in the plural between be and za is exactly the same material as we just saw for hinuk, but there's no opposition in the singular here. Now, none of those that we've seen so far are really that prevalent across the whole family. What you do tend to find most commonly is the one that is on this slide here, and variants of it. So the setup here is what I've tried to illustrate with the arrows, basically. The point is that, as usual, the absolutive singular seems to be the basis for the whole thing. But then, on the one hand, going off to the left with this arrow, you can add something to it in order to produce the oblique stem in the singular. And then separately, you can add something different in order to produce the absolutive plural. And then the oblique plural stem is produced on the basis of that absolutive plural. So the formal structure of the paradigm is laid out in this way. We've already seen that for Lesgian before, and that's shown by this very truncated version of the paradigm. Exactly the same thing is going on in this different branch in Andic, in character. Now, notice that the D is the oblique marker in Lesgian, and it's the plural marker in character. That's obviously a coincidence, and it's absolutely not what we're looking at. Regardless of the actual material they're using, what they come up with is the same implicational structure of the paradigm. And this is the kind of pattern that's very prevalent. Most languages in the family will have at least some nouns that behave like this. And for many languages, it's the main way, or even sometimes the only way that a noun can behave. Dagwa varieties are particularly keen on this way of doing things, but it does happen all over the place. And again, you can get variations on this setup. So in Achbach, you have a paradigm that basically works on this principle, but it just happens that there's been no special stem formative in the oblique singular of this word, and the cases are added directly onto the normal stem. Meanwhile, we saw this example from Batsby, where it's the singular that distinctively requires 2 stems, but the plural is happy with just the one. These patterns are also very common. So the point is that basically most of the relationships that you could imagine there being between different parts of the paradigm are going to be represented somewhere, but they usually make some kind of sense. Usually the singular oblique does one thing, the plural absolutive does another thing, and then the plural oblique is often based on one or the other, usually on the plural absolutive. But when you get into the details, there are definitely more weird and wonderful patterns going on as well. So I won't go into those any more than this, but just as a taste of what something a bit more complicated would look like. I've given this example from Ruttel. So look at what's going on here. First of all, it looks like we have a 2-stem pattern in the singular with a stem formative yeah, making the oblique stem. But then look at the plurals. So first of all, it turns out that in this language, the ergative doesn't have any case ending in the plural, although it does in the singular. That's unusual, but it's something we've already seen happen elsewhere. What's more strange is that evidently, when you look into what's going on inside these forms, it turns out that this yeah thing, which we thought was a singular oblique marker, actually turns up in the plural forms as well. And then it's followed by the plural marker, and then it can be followed by the plural oblique marker. So it turns out that it wasn't really a singular oblique marker at all. If it was doing any job, it was just saying this form is not the citation form. This is not the basic morphological form. Any other inflected form is going to have this yeah. So that looks like there's a lot going on there. But if I bring up the Latin example that we saw before, it turns out it's kind of similar to this. The yeah in Ruttel, which looks like a kind of weird extension to the root in a way. It just says, I am not the basic form. That's exactly what this N was doing in the Latin example. And so obviously this Ruttel example is getting a lot more towards the sort of fusional end of the scale. You don't get an awful lot of things like this in East Caucasian, but you get enough to show that it isn't really, there's a kind of continuum between these linguistic types. It's not that they're two totally separate ways of doing things, but you can always leak from one into the other somehow. So what can we get out of all of that? That was kind of a whistle-stop tour, and I said that there'll be lots of different things going on. So to me, this very much gives the impression that there is a way that East Caucasian nouns like to work. And I think that although I've been emphasizing the differences, seeing all of these examples does give the impression, it kind of strengthens the feeling that there is this family resemblance. There just aren't many sort of real universals or generalizations that you would want to make very rigorously. There are some things that you can say. The oblique plural stem formative is most often related to the absolutive plural, but more rarely it can be related to the oblique singular. Sometimes it's not related to either. And most weirdly, it can look like it's related to both, but that's just going to be in those funny cases where really the marker just means not absolutive singular. Another thing that can be mentioned is that there aren't many languages that actually show a consistent paradigm shape across the whole lexicon. Perhaps only Lesbian, Tabasaran does this, and the Dagwa varieties, which are two stem in both singular and plural. As I've been dwelling on, there's almost always a formal absolutive versus oblique opposition in the singular or in the plural, and very often in both. But the point is, in a sense, that all of this variation comes from just playing around with a few parameters of what basically is quite a homogeneous system across the family. And there are some definite preferences. So the kind of nice agglutinative Hinalug way of doing things is not favored, even though it seems like it would make the most sort of logical sense. What I'm going to go on to now is another general feature which is often relevant, and we've seen some examples already, but it comes up in different ways in different languages. This is what I've given the very sort of general name of morphophonological interactions. I've called it that basically because I wanted to reserve the right to put some stuff here that seemed very phonological and kind of superficial, but also there are other similar things going on that seem a bit more deep-rooted. The basic question is this: I've been acting as though there are these things called stem formatives, and you can hyphenate them off from the lexical part of the word on one side and the case marking on the other side. How true is that? If these languages were perfectly agglutinative, then that would be completely true, and it would be dead easy to put all of the hyphens in the right place. So let's look at some examples where it isn't quite so easy. Now, first of all, there are various different ways that the formative can interact with the case suffix. So some of those things really are superficial. For example, in Archie, you get this situation where you get a special plural oblique morpheme on top of the plural marker. In the ergative, well, the oblique stem is the ergative, and you get plurals like that end in chai. But in any other oblique case, when you get another case marker afterwards, what you see is che. That kind of thing is really unsurprising. It's just to do with possible syllable shapes and so on. What about in Hunzib? Vandenberg reports that there are a couple of oblique stem formatives, lo and li, that have a habit of losing that vowel before certain case endings. Not before all of them, but just before some of them. Now, it can't be a coincidence that out of all of the oblique stem markers, this is happening to the two that begin with an L, rather than some other thing. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem to be happening before all endings or all vowels or all consonants. And it's not as though Hunzib is going to have some kind of general phonological problem with a sequence like lo or li. So this looks kind of borderline. You need to look into it a bit more to decide what you thought was going on there. Whether, to what extent this is the phonology and to what extent this is the morphology deciding this kind of thing. When you turn to Godoberi, there are these two singular oblique stem formatives that look like shu and shi in their most sort of expanded form. Now, when you're making an ergative, you'd expect it to be shu di, but in fact, what you get is shti. That's mandatory. That is just what happens. but clearly the vowel has been dropped there. On the other hand, if you do the same with these ones in he, they have a choice about what they're going to do. They can either keep apart and make he di in a totally regular way, but they can also kind of fuse into a single thing, this t. That's optional. So again, you know, there's some sort of phonetic logic to some of these things, but equally the morphology must know about it. This isn't happening completely regularly. What I'm showing here on this slide is even more obviously morphological. So if you think of these stem formatives shu, shi in Gorabari, well, there are cognate forms in avar, which look like as and ash. And again, they have something funny going on in the ergative, but this time it's more serious. The normal thing for avar is for the ergative to be marked by this suffix tsa. In the first column here, you can see that the rain appears in the ergative with this form tsa da tsa. But nouns which have these two stem formatives in the singular, as and ash, they don't need an ergative marker at all, as you can see here. Now these elements, as and ash, and their cognates across avar-andic have an interesting story behind them, which we'll maybe get to later. I imagine that that's related to this situation. But this shows a nice little case where there really is a strong interaction between the case marker and the stem marker. And I've just read that a similar thing happens in Chirag Dagwa. Whatever's going on there must have a different story behind it. So the point of this is just to show that the interaction between stem formatives and case suffixes can go just beyond surfacey phonological looking things. Sometimes the presence of a particular stem formative actually rules out the presence of a suffix that you might otherwise have expected. Now, meanwhile, I pointed out something before in standard Dagwa that kind of goes in the opposite direction. You'd expect the genitive to use the oblique stem, and that is what happens in the plural as normal. But in the singular, you find that the genitive is kind of built onto something without the oblique marker. It looks as though what must have happened is that because the oblique singular in this variety is usually li, the combination of ruasi, li, la just led to ruasi, la. But then other nouns got the idea that they were supposed to be doing that as well. So you can see that whatever has happened in huna, it can't really have just happened by taking hunul and then adding li to it, for example, or adding ya and then adding la, which would be the normal genitive. You could never end up with huna that way. So something funny has been going on here. You can also look in the other direction. You can get interaction between the stem forming part and the lexical material itself. So I've been assuming that it always makes sense to make a division between those two things. But actually, to some extent, this kind of thing is about personal taste. So if you see something like in Botlik, the word for hand is re'a, but the oblique singular is re'u, well, you could be very agglutinative about it and say there is a morpheme u. When you add it to the end of re'a, that final a drops, and so you're left with re'u. But alternatively, you could treat this as more of a process of alternation and say that re'u shouldn't really be taken apart. It just is the oblique version of re'a, and there's this vowel alternation going on. And as the interactions between the lexical part and the formative become more and more substantial, that other way of looking at things might start to seem more appealing. We've just seen something like that in Dagwa. You get cases of vowels affecting each other at long distance, like in Archie. And then you can, things can go a lot further than that. Sometimes it really does seem to be easier to talk in terms of alternation. So in the Khwashi example, it's just the stress that differs between the absolutive and the oblique form. You also get cases which that would be a whole talk in themselves that I'm not really going to go into, where you have the what looks like an old vowel alternation pattern in the root, like English but, which becomes oblique bet. And then, of course, there are instances of full suppletion, like archichonol becomes plural chom. Now, in some languages, these kinds of things are much more important than in others. I'm most familiar with Andic languages, and I get the impression that in the Andic varieties I've seen, you can do pretty well by just using hyphens, hyphenating things off. and there's not an awful lot of synchronic phonological trouble or inherited inflectional complication that would make that difficult. But I don't think that's equally the case in all branches of the family. I think that Cesic and Na have more of these inherited issues going on that make the morphologist's life a bit more interesting. And of course, that's interesting from the historical point of view too, because it can help give you an insight into how the system used to work. Okay, suppose that you can actually identify stem formatives as separate things, which is something that does work pretty well most of the time. One further locus of variation between East Caucasian languages is how many formatives they actually have around to do the various jobs. It's pretty usual for these languages only to have a small number of oblique plural markers, however they fit into the paradigm shape, and often there might be only one. But the other two elements that I've been talking about, there can be lots of them. You can't make any kind of generalization about that. For example, you get languages where there are lots of oblique singular stem formatives, but not many plural markers, like in Hinnock. But equally, you can get the reverse, like in Sanji Dagwa. And it's not because they're kind of vying for space in a speaker's brain, so there can't be lots of both. Luck is reported to have dozens and dozens of each one of these things. So if a language does have a lot of these things all doing the same job, how does it decide where they're going to go? Well, a lot of the time, the ultimate answer is you just have to know the lexical entry of a particular noun is just supposed to come up with its required stem markers attached. This is the basic gist of all of these quotes on 3 different languages from 3 different branches. They all say basically, it's more or less lexical. Each noun just knows what it likes. So can we find any semblance of order in this at all? Well, one thing to note is that sometimes, even though you've got lots of formatives about, it's very clear that one of them is the default that you use if you haven't got any reason to use something else. There are different ways of identifying what might be the default. So in Batsby, which is spoken in Georgia, the plural marker is usually E, and notably, that's what you use on words that are borrowed in from Georgian. So it's clear that E is the go-to plural marker. In Archie, Kivilik observes that there are 12 different oblique singular formatives, but one of them is actually used with 80% of the nouns. That's way more, obviously, than any of the others, which are left to fight over the remaining 20%. So again, it seems clear that li is a default form here, or at least you need serious evidence to say it wasn't. Finally, in Hinnock, Walker points out that not only is mo the predominant oblique singular suffix, but it has a habit of being used on nouns, even though there is another one, even when there's another one that they can use, which is sort of lexically assigned to it, they can still go out of their way to use mo. So it looks like mo might be a default and gradually taking over the system. Sometimes you can get morphological conditioning in the basic sense that if you have a group of words that all end in the same derivational suffix, you'd expect them to all inflect in the same way. So a straightforward example is from Mehmet Nagwa. There are various plural markers, but nouns for inhabitants of places that are marked by having this suffix an, they always take the same plural ending, which is the t. That's not very surprising. You can imagine that kind of thing would turn up all over the place. What is a bit more interesting is when a particular derivational suffix brings with it some kind of specific inflectional behavior that you don't see elsewhere. So I've given an example of that from Lesgian. There's this morpheme wal that basically makes abstract nouns. Then you can use those abstract nouns in concrete ways, which is why we have the word bravery here, which can also mean a feat of bravery. The thing about this wal is that you'd expect the plural to be walad, because something with a back vowel at the end ought to choose the plural marker ar. But in fact, what you get is wiler, which is irregular in terms of the whole system, but totally regular in that all the relevant nouns do it. And then that brings with it some slightly unusual behavior in the oblique plural as well, where the vowel isn't lost before the R, as usually happens. That brings up the idea of phonological conditioning. We've also seen something going on in Standard Dagwa, where the oblique singular marker is usually the syllable li, but it sometimes turns up as just a y. That affects nouns with particular shapes, the ones that end in these sequences involving le or ne. Tabasaran gives quite a nice straightforward example of a choice being dependent on the phonological environment. If you're pluralizing nouns, there are some plurals that you just have to know lexically, but then instead of one default form, there are actually two, and they're each going to appear in a particular context. So after a vowel, you're going to get yir, and after a consonant, you're going to get ar. But what you more often get are things which you couldn't really call conditioning in a strong sense. It's more like if the root is of a particular shape, then that is going to make one choice of marker more likely, but it doesn't make it entirely predictable necessarily. So for example, Bagwalal has various plural markers. The ones that begin with a d are likely to appear apparently after polysyllabic stems ending in a sonorant. But that doesn't mean that this is bound to happen if you've got a word like that. It's more that if you look over the lexicon, you can find these kinds of patterns. And sometimes they're more sketchy, and sometimes they're closer to 100%. You get the same kind of thing going on in semantics. It's rare that you can predict exactly how a noun is going to inflect just on the basis of its semantics, but you can spot little pockets of predictability in the lexicon. So for example, in Godoberi, the plural e is often found with animates, but that's among many little things that you can notice, and they might cut across one another. So for example, in the same language, there's another plural ending, ibedi or ubedi, which tends to turn up with the young of animals, young of animates rather in general. I won't talk about gender here because that might come up a bit later. I also will skip over this slide, but just to say that given all of the different things going on, you can imagine that some words might not be exactly decided on how they were going to behave, and some descriptions point out that this is exactly what happens. You get some vacillation in the stem form that a particular lexeme will choose. The point in general is that you can't always talk about conditioning in a strict sense. There's usually some lexical arbitrariness in the system, but you can identify various features that might at least point in a particular direction, whether or not they end up being 100% predictable. This is maybe what you'd expect, because what's really going on is that as someone acquiring and using the language, you've got all these nouns which are similar to each other in some ways and dissimilar from each other in different ways, and potentially lots of different stem formatives to choose from. And every speaker actually either has to remember what stem a particular word takes or make their own judgment call about what would suit it best based on the behavior of the other words they know. So that setup is exactly the kind of place where you'd expect there to be little pockets of regularity and different things going on. They give you an idea of how all these different considerations play out at the same time. I've taken one particular variety where the description goes into some detail about what characterizes the different morphological groups. That's the Kriz dialect of Alik. I've not given a full rundown of the lexicon here, but these are the kind of patterns that have been noted. So you can have the oblique stem marked by nothing. That happens with the nouns that are highest in referentiality, personal names, but also close family members, that kind of thing. Also some very kind of iconic places like the field and the village. The formant a seems to appear a lot of the time with mass nouns. It does some body parts as well. E specifically seems to do small body parts along with other things, but among the body parts that are done by E, they all seem to be relatively small. This RD seems to, in fact, this one is a very homogeneous group. It only does animals, and it only does one syllable animals. But some other one syllable animals turn up in a different group. So the relationship isn't bidirectional. You can't predict in both directions there. Nonetheless, this is a pattern that has been noticed. If you have a vowel final dissyllable, then it's going to end in, this is J, in fact. This is using the Azerbaijani alphabet, so this C stands for J. Borrowed word will also appear in that group, whereas lexicalized compounds have G on the end. Now the point is, this isn't intended to cover anything 100%. No one's saying that this makes it completely predictable, but all of these things are clearly relevant to some extent, and they run the gamut. Their phonology, morphology, semantics, history of the particular lexeme, all seem to be involved. So that was a kind of highlights tour of the various things that you can find going on in these systems of noun inflection when you look at them in detail. I'm going to finish off today by coming back to something I said before, which is that it isn't only nouns you have to worry about. Other things that don't start life as nouns can also be used as nouns, so to speak. That is, things like adjectives and participles. They can potentially be substantivized and used as the head of a noun phrase. So this is something that East Caucasian languages seem to do quite readily. In a few languages, you may have to add some element. For example, in Lesbian, the word for green is katsu. And if you want to say the green one, that's katsudi. But most of the time, you don't need to add any special element. You can just take the modifier, do nothing overtly to it at all, and that thing will work as the absolutive singular form of the substantivized modifier. So that's things like mossi means bad as an attributive in Batsby. And then you can use that as a substantive to mean the bad one. Often this also works with demonstratives. So this Andy form ho is the masculine form of the demonstrative that means this, as in this boy. But you can also just use it on its own to mean this one or he. In Andy and in various languages, there are no dedicated third-person pronouns. They're just substantivized demonstratives like this. These kind of things have been called secondary nominals. So they don't begin life as nouns, but they can be used in nominal function. So the question is then, how are these things going to fit in with the nominal stem system that we've been looking at here? So one way that this can happen, and especially with demonstratives, is that it can just be totally unpredictable. So we saw before that phonologue is relatively straightforward and agglutinative in general. But here, in this particular case, we've got the demonstrative do, meaning this, substantivized. And as you can see, this isn't particularly well behaved. We can actually identify some patterns in here. So these Roman numerals are for the genders, and it looks as though the oblique stem of first and second gender begins with a v. The oblique stem of third and fourth gender begins with se. And then you have other stuff going on in the plural. But basically, this is just lexically specific inflectional behavior. We'll come back to phonologue in a second, but now I'm going to show how this works in Hinuk. In some ways, Hinuk is actually in quite a nice position because in the plural, all nouns already behave in the same way, with be in the absolutive and za in the oblique, as we saw before. So, of course, the secondary nominals are happy to do that as well. So in this word oya, meaning other, if you want to say with others, where others would go into the oblique plural, you can just add za and then the case ending that you wanted. But there are lots of different ways of marking a singular oblique. So how do these secondary nominals do it? Well, it turns out that it's partly predictable from the type of attributive modifier that you started off with. But then again, there's still some stuff which is just lexical. You just have to know it. So participles and most adjectives to steer clear of the whole problem and attach the suffixes directly. There are some adjectives which add an a before the case ending, like in yegueyas, the small ones. When you come to numerals, they have their own thing again. So if you want to use a numeral as a substantive, rather than saying like 3 houses, you're saying the three of them. Practically all numerals show an alternation where they take off a final no and add ra instead. So the 3 of them is flono in the absolutive and flora is the oblique stem if you want to add a case marker on it to make something like to the 3 of them in the dative. Now, ra does exist as an oblique stem marker that you do find in nouns, but it is only used by about 2 or 3 nouns in the language, so it's very marginal. But in the numerals, it turns out to be the totally normal way of doing things. And it's just 1 and 2 that behave a bit differently. What you can find is that in some languages, a special system of stem formation has developed, which specifically caters to these secondary nominals and might not appear anywhere else. This is sometimes called the attributive declension because it enables you to inflect these things that kind of originally belong in the attributive position. So I've given a couple of examples from Lesbian languages. In Lesbian, I said that you use D to make a secondary nominal, and that applies to all sorts of attributive modifiers. But that's just in the absolutive singular. This D is replaced by da in the oblique, and then you have the plural bur and oblique plural buru. And I don't think those things turn up otherwise. Meanwhile, in Agul, also from the Lesbian branch, you have a similar thing going on. the basic substantivizer is f in this variety, but then you have these other stem formatives in the rest of the paradigm. I've tried to suggest with the colors that this is another one of those cases where the t here is not really an oblique singular marker. Effectively, it's just not the absolutive singular marker, as we saw in that word from Ruttel before. Now, Agol and Lesgian don't have gender, but Sakho is a lesgic language that does have gender. It has 4 genders, and those are signaled already on attributive forms, and that makes for a much more complicated setup. So these are the forms of the substantivized this or this one. I've simplified this a bit, and I'm not going to go into everything that's going on here. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is that in the singular, there are 3 different oblique stem formatives, and they depend on what the gender of your secondary nominal is. So it could be gu or g or chi, depending on what gender you're after. And this pattern is used on all attributives. I'm going to finish up by looking at what the attributive declension is like in the Andic group. And this is a bit of a paradigm from Andi, which is the East Caucasian language that I'm most familiar with. So this is the paradigm of the adjective baru, beautiful, inflected as a substantive to mean the beautiful one. If you look in the singular, gender 1, which refers to male humans, uses this oblique stem format shu, and the other genders all use this other oblique formative shi. And all Andic languages have some close cognate of this setup. In the plural, it's a bit more variable, but you basically get the same kind of thing happening. And in Andi, this really does apply very widely. As I said before, even words like this can be substantivized, and then they get used as third-person pronouns. And it's always regular, like you see here. I'm going to skip over a kind of historical interlude and show something that I think is quite interesting about how this system has developed in Andic. The behavior of these things have become so prominent that it even appears on some primary nouns. And I find this a bit mysterious why this would have happened. In Andi specifically, it appears on quite a lot of nouns, not just ones for people, where you could think maybe the male or femaleness is an important thing about them, but even ordinary nouns like stone, hints or has this ergative singular hints oldi, where the le is the sort of is another form of this shli that we saw before. But when it does appear on words for humans, this is one place where the choice of stem formative can actually be meaningful in some way. It can give you information about the noun, which isn't located anywhere else. So homolorishti can only be a male friend, and homolorildi can only be a female friend. I suppose in principle, this could also have been a friend of some other gender, like it could be an animal that was your friend, for example, because this only makes the distinction between male human and everything else. But of course, in practice, this ends up being a distinction between male friend and female friend, male guest and female guest, where it's the stem formation that is telling you which one of those things you're dealing with. Even more than that, it seems clear that the non-masculine oblique singular marker, which takes its form li or just le, depending on the context, has actually become even more broad. So I get the impression that its job now is just to make case marking available to anything that might want case marking, regardless of what it is. So in this first example, which is from an Andi speaker, you've got something like code switching going on. The sentence starts out in Russian, каждое хозяйство, and then moves into Andi. But because each household, каждое хозяйство, is the transitive subject, as part of the switch, it takes on ergative marking. And in doing that, it needs this stem formant in order to make the case marking available to it. Now you could say, well, maybe this is just that the word хозяйство, household in particular, is getting borrowed into the language, and it's taking a kind of default stem form. And so maybe this example isn't necessarily all that striking in itself. In the next one, it's attaching to a verb phrase headed by an infinitive. So we've got a comparison here. In order to do comparison than something, use the contestive case in chu, And again, it feels like the job of this marker is to make that infinitive available for case marking. And finally, in this last one, which I think is really nice, you've got two infinitive clauses strung together. So the whole sentence says something like, to relax is much nicer than to dig earth and lug stones. The way that's done is with two infinitives that are yoked together using this both and thing, which is lo, those clitics. But then this L marker is attaching to that whole structure, where the last element in the structure is actually this additive marker, lo, meaning both and. So what I think is really striking about this is that we started off thinking of these things as stem formatives, which are required by particular lexemes. But here we have a situation where you couldn't sort of put this into a paradigm. There is no sort of paradigm going on here. This is various kinds of whole syntactic and other strange unit. But as soon as it needs case marking, this is how you're going to do it. And it still seems to want these stem formatives just in order to make case marking available. So I think that's quite a nice pattern. And I don't know whether, I don't know sort of how far you can find the same thing going on in different branches of the family. But this is something very striking, I think, about how Andy in particular does things. Okay, so finally, I'll sum up for you after what's been an awful lot of information thrown at you about East Caucasian nominal stems. I think the nominal paradigm in East Caucasian has a distinctive feel, and one reason for this is its characteristic stem formation behaviour. Nominal morphology obviously isn't heavily fusional, but it does have complexities which take it a long way past just being straightforwardly agglutinative. In particular, it has this absolutive oblique distinction quite widely, which isn't really necessary. On the other hand, it does fit in with other things about East Caucasian morphology and syntax. Against this general backdrop, there's a large amount of variation, both across and within languages. And some of the kinds of variation that you can get are in the form of the stem markers, the principles of their distribution, the implicational patterns in the paradigm, and how far the languages use an attributive declension. And on that note, finally, nominal stem formation processes can apply beyond the noun, even far beyond the noun, as it turns out, and even on things which are very much not lexemes. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention. I have my references here in the handout, but you have the handout anyway. So there we go.
Thank you very much.
Should I stop sharing my screen now, or how shall we do it?
Yes, it will be for a moment. Now I think we are going to the question section. So I will share my screen and you will see the question here. So here, as you see, there are several questions and some answers. So don't worry. Yeah.
Okay. How frequent are East Caucasian-like case paradigms typologically? Yeah, I mean, I imagine that Peter Arkadiev is a better person to answer that than me. Honestly, I don't know, actually. It seems like the kind of thing that you'd expect to find plenty of. I mean, that's just a sort of a feeling, in the sense that kind of everyone recognizes that sort of agglutinativity and fusionality, if that's the word, are kind of idealizations, and real languages aren't like that. East Caucasian has found a kind of a niche of being somewhere in between, but it wouldn't surprise me if you could find this sort of pattern elsewhere. yeah, if Peter Arkadiev can't think of lots, then I certainly won't be able to. Marked singulars in the terms of singulative and or collective. That would be interesting to see, because yeah, certainly one, obviously one, you expect the absolutive singular. You expect the singular to be the basic form a lot of the time, and if it isn't, then that might suggest that sort of the way that you usually encounter these things in the world is in the plural, and you need to specify when you're only finding one of them. Aha. Interesting. I did come across some discussion which is not exactly about this, but it's kind of about the possibility of where there are two different plural markers that can be applied to the same noun. Sometimes, sometimes that just happens because a language isn't entirely fixed on which one it prefers, but sometimes that's because one of them has more of a kind of collective sense and one of them has more of an individuating sense. So you could talk about sort of, cows could mean sort of, there's about 5 of them and you know which ones they all are, or it could mean the whole sort of notion of cattle. And those are two quite different kinds of plurals. And you get some languages where the plural marker that is relevant to those things sort of becomes, the semantics is tracked by the two different plural markers. But that's obviously the other way around from what this question is asking. It wouldn't surprise me if that was what was going on here, because although I compared this to the Latin example of leo, we know pretty well that a lot of the time in those Latin examples, it's because of some phonological thing. That consonant just couldn't appear at the end of the word, and that's why it drops off in the nominative singular. I get the impression that that isn't generally going to be the explanation of why you have these funny types of behaviour in these East Caucasian examples. But I haven't looked into sort of what these examples are like enough to get a feel for what sort of words are affected by this issue. Northwest Caucasian languages. Okay, cool.
But we again have some nice answers by Peter.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Again, it wouldn't sort of, I don't find it particularly surprising that a language would end up making some sort of morphological distinction between absolutive and oblique. It's kind of more of a problem from on the theoretical side, especially with this feature that some languages have adjectives which agree, but they only agree for obliqueness. That is, they either mark an absolutive, they either have an absolutive form or an everything else form. That kind of opposition suggests that maybe absolutive versus oblique really is a morphosyntactic feature of the noun, in some sense, separately from the specific cases. But that would be doubling up. The cases are already doing all that work. You're not getting any more. You're not sort of learning anything new by learning something is oblique if you already know that it's dative. So it would be strange. It's sort of difficult to build into a theoretical model. And yet, sort of on the descriptive side, it sometimes looks very clear that what you want to say is these words are agreeing in obliqueness as opposed to agreeing in case. I don't know whether there is a sort of accepted way of dealing with that issue.
There are also some comments over here. And oh no, here they are.
In Tibetan, the ergative is formed from the genitive, but not other cases. So the idea being that the other cases are formed sort of directly on the lexical root, for example, and the ergative stands with the genitive in being different. That's interesting. I mean, I think sort of people are familiar with the idea that the ergative is kind of a strange thing diachronically. Ergatives tend to come from instrumentals or come from other things. And so there may be a sort of diachronic explanation. If the ergative in particular is behaving in an interesting way, it may be that that's sort of reflecting some aspect of its semantic history, and that it didn't always used to be a straight ergative. I mean, indeed, even in these East Caucasian languages, the ergative tends to also be available as an instrumental, and you have to sort of look at the syntax to see which one it's being sometimes. And in some of these languages, the ergative and the genitive are the same, even in East Caucasian. Modern Armenian. Okay. Right, I see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's looking quite similar. I think sort of often when you get nominal paradigms that are large, there are lots of cases. Often some of those cases are sort of more or less transparently built onto a pre-existing case, maybe with a sort of a postposition that got glommed into it or something. And so you can end up with these kinds of patterns where you have a bunch of cases which sort of seem to be primary, and then a bunch of secondary cases which are all sort of formally built onto the genitive or something, even if you can't tell what they have to do with the genitive anymore. And I can imagine that's the kind of thing that can happen aerially quite a lot. If you've got languages around you that have big case systems, and you're sort of lolloping along with a couple of cases, but tons of other things, then you may turn some of those things into cases and end up with a big case system as well, which would have that kind of shape to it potentially. Okay. In Avar-Andic, there seems to be a tendency for the attributive declension to spread on nouns, sometimes on oblique forms only. Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so sometimes on oblique forms only. Okay, yeah, so that's I mean, that's an interesting, I like the parallel with the Russian setup, and I hadn't thought of that, and I hadn't really thought about sort of how Russian has ended up in that situation. Yes, that's a nice parallel. Yeah, set markers have undergone expansion of some sort in some languages. Yeah, I think, I mean, I think it would be really nice to be able to kind of track the usage, you know, to the extent that you can compare an oblique stem formative in one language to an oblique stem formative in another, and say this is clearly the same element. It would be very interesting to kind of track which ones are sort of receding and which ones are growing, and whether you can sort of look at a big family and, you know, say the Andic languages, which are all fairly close together historically, and sort of see if you can trace back to what the original plural marker used to be for this kind of word, and why it got diverted off into this other track in this language or whatever. We ought to sort of have enough lexical material now that you could sort of trace those kinds of things in the same way that you can trace the etymology, or you can trace the genealogy of the lexical items themselves, compare across languages and see sort of, well, which seem to be sort of the fossilized remnants of the original system that you kind of get by getting rid of all the ones which are clearly modern and productive. Estonian. Yes. Well, this is exactly what I was thinking of, more or less. That in Estonian, I know that there are plenty, there are lots of cases, and some of them seem to be built onto sort of more basic primary cases. And I think you get something approximating that issue of not quite agreement in adjectives, where some of the cases that are sort of longer and further down in the paradigm, although you expect adjectives to agree in Estonian, some of the ones towards the bottom of the paradigm don't actually sort of take on the full morphological machinery of one of these complicated cases. They just go in the genitive or something like that. And so you have what looks like a genitive adjective going with a noun in a complicated spatial case, for example. I haven't got the details exactly right there, but that seems sort of similar to the absolutive versus oblique distinction in East Caucasian, suggesting that maybe originally it was just absolutive versus oblique, and potentially all of the oblique cases have grown out of an original sort of single oblique thing, and the adjectives are sort of they've retained that older system. Archiplural inessive is also identical, which adds to your maybe on oblique stem of being shown no behaviour. Okay, I see, yes. Oh yes, about Archie, yes. I got the impression that in this quiz variety, it was kind of lexical at this point. So it wasn't really about sort of, it couldn't be optional. This is just the way that the nouns did it. And when you look at the nouns, you can tell that it seems to be the ones that are highly referential, that have that pattern. But it isn't about sort of referentiality in context, or it isn't about sort of having the option available to you or anything. But clearly, yes, there's, it's that could well be a kind of standardization of something that was originally a bit more variable, and you can sort of imagine, you can come up with sort of semantic and pragmatic reasons why it would work like that, I think.
Okay, so I think it's all questions and comments that we had in chat. And I will stop sharing for this part. Yeah, I'm right. So now I would like to thank you all for participating today. And I also really happy and would like to thank Stephen for answering this question and providing that so fruitful talk today. And I think we can finish now, but I hope that we will see you again in a week on our next lecture by Johanna Nichols. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I think that's all. Let's call it a day. And goodbye, you all.